Indeed. Today is Tuesday. It's the 24th. Next week, Tuesday, will be the 31st. And that's the day that King Charles III and Queen Camilla will be coming into the country. They'll be here until Friday, the 3rd of November. Now, to talk about that conversation about what their majesties are coming to do, what we expect from that royal visit, we're joined by the British High Commissioner to Kenya, Neil Wigan, in the studio. Good morning.
Good morning.
Welcome to Kenya's biggest conversation.
Thank you. It's my first interview on Kenyan radio, so I'm looking forward to it.
From Kenya to the world.
Yeah.
Karibu sana.
Asante sana.
We'll talk about very many things, of course, including, the relationship between Kenya and the UK over the very many years. But to welcome you to the conversation about the visit by King Charles III, Charles I has the day's proverb. And the proverbs this week are from Zanzibar.
Thank you, Eric.
First of your name.
Well, it is always wonderful, Your Excellency, when your subjects address you. As gracefully as he has. Heri kujikwa kidole kuliko ulimi.
Heri kujikwa kidole
Yes.
kuliko ulimi.
Yes.
Translate that to English, Neil.
You're beating my Swahili by a long way. I've only been here a couple of months. Give me a bit of time.
Okay. She's been here a couple of years. She can do that for you.
So the long and short of it is better to...
It's not long and short.
Hour.
Just translate
Look,
it.
don't pressure me this way.
It's just direct translation. You've done very well.
Better to stumble on your toes than stumble with your tongue.
Good. On a scale of 1 to 10, you are at 11.
Voila.
Yes.
It's good advice for a diplomat.
Better to stumble on your toes than to stumble with your tongue. What's your direct interpretation of it? Or what do you think this proverb is saying?
So that you can make physical mistakes, that's fine, but what you say really matters and has an impact, and that's important. And really, as a diplomat, that's what I get paid to do, is to make sure that I say the right thing.
Is that what they trained you?
They tried
First
to.
lesson, first day of diplomat school. Heri kujikwa.
We should have it as the crest of the diplomatic academy, I think, the new motto.
Yeah, yesterday when we were expecting you to be here yesterday, unfortunately you couldn't make it because you had another engagement. But here you are. When you talked about it, CT said, his name is Wigan. There's a football club called Wigan Athletic. Maybe this is the owner of the club. And they said, we're going to ask him.
There is a rugby club.
There's also a rugby club.
So sadly, the football club is not doing well at the moment. The rugby club is doing better. And there's the book by George Orwell, so you can refer to that.
All right. And all of them three are you.
I'm named after the town. The town's not named after me.
Therefore, there's even a town.
There's even a town. Yeah. Karibu sana to Kenya. You've been here a couple of months now, having been posted into this country. How do you find it so far?
So far, so good. So Kenya's not new to me. I was ambassador to Somalia about 10 years ago, so my family lived in Nairobi. So Nairobi was always where I came for a break from Somalia. So my children really, their first memories of Kenya. They loved growing up here. My wife had a great time here. So we're really delighted to be back. But it's very different to live and work in a country than to come as a visitor. So I'm trying to get out a bit and get out of Nairobi and see as much of Kenya as I can.
So 10 years ago, you were in Somalia as the representative of the UK government. From there, where did you go?
So after Somalia, I went to be the Africa Director in London. So I was covering the whole of Africa from London. And in fact, Kenya was the country that I came to most doing that job because of what an important partner it is for us. And then after that, I was the ambassador to Israel for 4 years.
Hey. They send you to all these places.
They send me to, and I was in Congo before, so I get a good mix of countries. I won't tell you which is the reward and which is the...
No, it'll come out through the course of this conversation. So let's get straight into it. The announcement that the King Charles III and Queen Camilla will be coming into the country next week. And this is going to be the first visit to a Commonwealth country Why is it important?
So it's a big deal. It's, as you say, it's their first visit to a Commonwealth country. It's their first visit to any country outside Europe as king. And so the fact that they chose Kenya is a big deal. There's a very close family relationship with Kenya. As you know, the king's mother became queen in Kenya in 1952. The king has visited Kenya 4 times as the Prince of Wales. His son got engaged to his wife here, so there's a very strong family connection. But also the relationship between the two countries is extremely strong, and as with President Ruto yesterday, and we were discussing that strength. And we see Kenya as a key partner for everything that we're trying to do, from the environment and climate change to tackling counter-terrorism. And we want to use the visit to show that cooperation.
There's a lot that has changed in Kenya since 1952, obviously. And one can say maybe that's one of the events that really, well, could suggest that the two countries cemented somehow. A lot has changed between that time and today. What are some things that you would say then would be hoped to realize through this visit that will happen?
So I think that point of change is really important. So we have a really long and deep history, but we really want to talk about where the relationship is now and what we want to do together in the future. So the themes that we've picked for the visit are around youth, they're around innovation, and it's around the environment. And those are all big forward-looking themes. And it's to show how we, so for example, we're taking the king to see Kenyan technology companies, because there's some really amazing innovation, whether it's in climate change or financial technology and so on, which shows how much Kenya has to offer the world. And then when it comes to climate change itself, obviously we had the Africa Climate Summit here in Nairobi a few weeks ago. So we're looking at everything from that global scale, but also how you get communities involved in conservation at the local level, including at the coast. And that's something that the king, who's been passionate about climate change and environment for decades, he really wants to see some of the lessons that we can learn from Kenya.
Something that I've always found not perplexing, intriguing. What exactly does a king do? I mean, I know what a president does. I have an idea what a prime minister does or doesn't do. But in a country where you have a prime minister, you have a parliament, then you have a king, what does the king do?
So he's the ceremonial head of state. So he doesn't make policy. As you say, the prime minister and the government, they do that. The parliament makes all the laws. But the king sort of represents the British people. And so the fact that he's coming to Kenya is a symbol of the connection that we want to have between the British people and the Kenyan people. He's the symbol of the state. And of course, you know, in Britain, we have a huge amount of affection and respect for the monarchy. And you saw that when the late Queen died and then at the coronation of the king, just this huge popular enthusiasm, not only in Britain, but really across the whole world, and that respect for the royal family. So they mean something, they sum up the nation at home and around the world.
Explain that a little bit more, because all your neighbors, whether it's France, Germany, they had kings or something of that sort at some point or the other. Some even had an emperor. But somehow, not only did they diminish, one doesn't even talk about them. What is it about the British people and this holding on to this monarchy?
So I think it's partly continuity. I mean, really, this is the same royal family which has gone through revolutions, it's gone through changes, but for 800 or 900 years. So they've always been there. So whether it's through the difficult times in the Second World War, where they really helped maintain the morale of the nation, through all the changes that we've been through the last 80 years, the royal family has always been there as a sort of a constant, solid symbol. And then around the world, there's something about sort of saying the King of Great Britain that has a magic and an impact which nobody else really, presidents don't do. There's something about a king which makes people feel this is something really special and important.
You're right.
It's a good question. I mean, I honestly don't know the answer, but it's there. There's something different and special about a king.
You see, why I find it intriguing is that there are nations that form part of what we call the Commonwealth. And some of them are essentially independent states, but the Queen, the King, still the sovereign leader of those nations. Now, it's the intriguing part of all this. And yet, in everything else, they are fairly independent, but they still acknowledge the king now as the sovereign.
So not all members of the Commonwealth do have the king as a sovereign. So Kenya being a really good example, Kenya is a full republic, but is still a member of the Commonwealth, and we really want to celebrate that link to the Commonwealth during the visit. But yes, there are some other countries which still have the king as the formal head of state. I'd say again, it's a very ceremonial position, and it's the decision of those countries. They've decided that for whatever reason, this is something that they like to have in a way. Again, because of this magic dust somehow that the British royal family has.
Yeah. So, I mean, there are clouds that still linger from colonialism, right? And the visit by the king and the queen coming to Kenya would spur some of those conversations to come into the limelight. And the things that happened in Kenya as a result of colonialism, still some very fresh wounds, some scars today. Would those things come out in conversation today when in relation to a visit by the monarchy to a former colony, and how that plays out in a relationship today? Do those things come out in conversation? People are more aware of what happened during those times, and people are having conversations about them, real conversations about them today, and talk about injustices and talk about reparations that should be made or at least considered. Do those things come out, and are they well front and center for the monarchy as well?
Yes, so we will definitely address and acknowledge those issues during the visit. As I said, we'll be focused on celebrating the present and talking about what we do together in the future. But we think it's really important that we address openly what happened in the past. And because the relationship is so strong, we think we can do that clearly and openly. And this is something that the king has a very strong personal interest in. In his other trips, when he was as Prince of Wales, he's spoken very openly about issues like slavery and the terrible crime that was. In Kenya, we have expressed deep regret for what happened during the emergency period and the treatment of Mau Mau in particular, and we made an out-of-court settlement to some of those people. And while I've been here, I've made an effort myself to go and visit communities and individuals and families who were affected by that period to make sure that I understand that better myself. And I've been hugely impressed. People talk very openly about what happened in the colonial period, whether that was right at the beginning or during the Mau Mau period as well. But a lot of them are also very focused on the future, but they appreciate the fact that I come and talk to them about that openly and that I show an interest in learning. And I think the king will come very much in that spirit as well.
The British government has, like you've said, previously acknowledged and expressed deep regret over what happened. Deep regret is not an apology.
No, so we choose the language carefully. We expressed deep regret. We said it in Parliament, so we said it in the most public way. We've engaged very closely with the Mau Mau veterans who were affected, and we not only paid compensation individually, but also we helped arrange for the monument, which now sits in Uhuru Park. So we've been very open about those difficult bits of our history.
Why fall short of making an apology?
So we haven't made an apology really in any context. It's an extremely difficult thing to do. So what we think we want to do is we want to acknowledge the difficult bits of history. We want to talk about them openly, both to the countries which were affected, but also, as I say, to the individuals and communities.
What's difficult about making an apology?
So an apology starts to take you into difficult legal territory. And so, as I say, the settlement that we made was an out-of-court settlement, so it showed our sincerity and our desire and our openness about recognising that abuses had been committed. But that was the route that we chose and was accepted by the Mau Mau Veterans Association.
Okay. So during the visit here, their Majesties will, from the statement that was made by the High Commission, they'll acknowledge the more painful aspects of the UK and Kenya shared history, including the emergency period, 1952 to 1960. His Majesty will take time during the visit to deepen his understanding of the wrongs suffered in this period by the people of Kenya. Together, their Majesties will tour the new museum dedicated to Kenya's history and lay a wreath at the tomb of the unknown warrior at Uhuru Gardens, as well as visit the site of the Declaration of Kenya's independence in 1963. The words here, to deepen his understanding of the wrongs suffered in this period. What does that mean?
So firstly, he will go to the museum, and that's where Kenya tells its own history about what happened in that period, and he'll see how it's told, but also he'll meet Kenyans who are learning about their history, school children. So he'll understand both what happened, but also how it's taught to Kenyans and how Kenyans perceive it today. The symbolism of him going to the place where the Kenyan flag was raised for the first time, and his father was present at that very important ceremony, again shows us sort of engaging very clearly and positively with that history. And there may be opportunities as well for him to meet people who can talk about how their communities were affected, or how their families were affected, or how they themselves were personally affected during the British period. And as I say, His Majesty has a very deep and sincere desire to understand these things better.
And then what? Then what after understanding? So that he is going to have a deep understanding of what happened. What do you expect him to do after that?
So part of this goes back to what we were talking to CT about. So he's not the head of state. He doesn't make policy. I think he will talk about this openly, and we hope the fact that him talking about these issues openly will, for those communities and for normal Kenyans, will be an important symbolic moment. But then it's a decision for the British government to say, as we engage with a particular community or a particular group and we hear what their requests are, whether there is something that we can do to help. In many cases, their requests are actually more for the Kenyan government than they are for the British government, but we'll see if there are things that we can do.
These are definitely choppy diplomatic waters, because history, unfortunately, as it is taught, may not necessarily represent the truth to many people. It's just history. Now, the history of Kenya and the British, if I'm to come to the present, again, an intriguing and unique occurrence. When you have a relationship that began with colonization and then now ends up with partnerships, what does it say about the two peoples of these countries? Is it that they're able to forget the past, or that they're able to bridge the differences that they have, or they're able to stare the truth of their histories clearly in the face and say, folks, the best way forward ought to be this? And if so, are you suggesting that this visit by His Majesty is one such symbol?
Yes. So I'm a historian by background, so this is my pet subject, and I can talk about it for far too long.
You're in good company.
So, I mean, but I mean, I do think the present of the relationship between Britain and Kenya is hugely affected by the history, and it's really important that we understand that. But as I said before, I think we're now at a stage where the relationship is good, so we can talk very openly about some of these very difficult and painful issues. We do think that the partnership is much more about future-leading issues. So as I said, we're going to be talking about technology, we're going to be talking about innovation, we're going to be introducing the King to Kenyan fashion designers and artists and so on. So he really sees what that future is, and that's what we think we should be focused on. But we absolutely understand that we need to understand the history, and we hope that the symbolism of the King, the symbol of the British people, talking about these issues and going to particular places, we hope that will mean a lot to Kenyans.
The symbolism often represents reality, because it's like someone showing you a 3D picture. Instead of you imagining it, you're told, have a look and see. But moving forward, maybe this isn't quite your domain, but I'm going to ask it anyway.
That's a dangerous position.
No, it's nothing horrific. I'm thinking of the relationship that Kenya has had with Britain over the years, and I'm looking at how it is. Many Kenyans, the fact that we're speaking this language, identify with what it is that is predominantly British. Now, moving forward, do you think that it is the business and the interest of the government of the day in Britain to actually understand what it is that what we call the common person in this country considers to be in their interest?
Yes.
Not what the politicians tell them.
So, yes, absolutely. But then I would say, I mean, the average Kenyan, I think, is 19 years old. So for them, a lot of what happened in history very much is history. And when I talk to younger Kenyans, they're interested in, can they study in the UK? Can they work in the UK? Can they get a job working for a British company? So they're very much focused on the future and what can we do together. And that's very much what we want to do and what we want to focus on. And I think the fact that the King is going to come and he is going to be talking about these issues. He's going to look at Kenyan fashion designers. He's going to see the successes that Kenya has. And I think that will symbolize how much the relationship has changed from when his mother became queen, when Kenya was still part of the British Empire, when his father came with Jomo Kenyatta to celebrate Kenya's independence. But now we're in a world where we're working together, for example, on training Kenyan Marines who are being trained by the British Royal Marines, and the King was himself did the British Royal Marine training course, and we're working with them so that we can face common threats like terrorism together. And I think that will really symbolize how much the relationship has changed.
Let's take a break and then we continue the conversation shortly. We are hosting Neil Wigan. He is the British High Commissioner to Kenya. He's here as we talk about the planned visit by King Charles III and Queen Camilla next week on Tuesday the 31st. They'll be in the country until the 3rd of November. That's Friday. What's expected after this trip? What is the itinerary? I'm going to read some of what the King and Queen are going to be doing. Their Majesties will be greeted in Nairobi with a ceremonial welcome at State House, and they'll each attend bilateral meetings. The King with the President and the Queen with the First Lady, and then the President will host a state banquet at State House. Then His Majesty will visit the United Nations office in Nairobi. He'll attend a technology showcase, meeting Kenyan entrepreneurs. He'll host a reception focused on Kenya's young people. Their Majesties will visit a Commonwealth War Graves Commission cemetery and very many other things that they'll be doing. That's what we're discussing with the High Commissioner. Keep it here. We'll be back shortly after this break.
Spice. Nairobi.
The conversation continues with British High Commissioner to Kenya, Neil Wigan. He's here in the studio. We're talking about the planned visit by the King and Queen next week. We're also talking about Kenya-UK relations. Kenya and Britain have actually had long-standing relations. We have a signed pact on defense cooperation. We have a trade pact. We've had conversations about Kenya and UK cooperating in matters of education. Former President Uhuru Kenyatta and former Prime Minister of the Britain discussing on education matters. The UK opening up gates for Kenyan nurses to go and work and live in Britain, and so on and so forth. We'll be talking about these positives shortly, but I've got to go back into one question. We have a State Department for culture in this country. And one of the mandates of this State Department is to preserve our culture and look at where our culture has been previously desecrated and try and see, okay, so there are some artifacts that belong to Kenyan communities that are not in Kenya. Some of them are in Britain. Plans on returning our artifacts?
So this is one of the things that I'm trying to learn and understand better. I know from other countries that the whole issue around artifacts is incredibly complicated, and including who owns them, what exactly the history is. So it's very much a case-by-case issue, and we have to look through it. But yes, I've heard some very clear families and communities saying these are important artifacts, these are things that are really important to us, and we, in some cases we know, in other cases we think that they are somewhere in Britain and we'd like to see them returned. So this is one of the issues that while I'm High Commissioner, I really want to look into and understand and see if there's things that I can do, the things that should not belong in Britain should come back to Kenya.
You know, there are some fairly big shoes that you've stepped into.
I know.
One of the shoes that you've stepped into is of a gentleman by the name of Sir Edward Clay.
Indeed.
Now, he was ambassador, High Commission to this country at a time when Kenya was going through some things which are not very dissimilar to what we're going now. Now, what we know him best for are the things he said, or some would say things he shouldn't have said. Now, whether it was his own person leaning or whether it was in tandem with the policy of Great Britain at that time, well, one can only guess. Or someone like you can tell us. Now, here you are. Given the relationship we've had as countries, and given some of the issues that many Kenyans hold dear to their hearts, are you of the persuasion that perhaps you could step into those shoes and in your own way, in your own time, and in your own manner.
So I
not vomit on the shoes.
Yes.
The famous. So I asked him whether he ever regretted that statement, and he says no. He still remains proud of it. He said the reaction that he got from most Kenyans to it, even though some people hated him for it, but he felt that he stood up and did the right thing. And so for me as a diplomat, that's something I always have in mind, is when you're in that position and you say something which some people will really hate you for, but you feel it's the right thing to do, then do you do it? On the other hand, a lot of diplomacy is working behind the scenes and is building relationships and so on. So we always have this balance between what we say publicly when we feel there's no alternative, or do we think that we get the results that we're trying to get better by working behind the scenes with relationships? And that's the job that I have. I've had some very difficult situations. So I worked in, for example, when I was ambassador in Congo, I worked on the elections there, and I was quite a prominent figure and was accused of taking sides and so on. So I've lived that life. In Somalia, I had to take some big decisions. So I'll see what happens in Kenya and whether I'm put into that position. Clearly, we don't want to interfere in Kenyan internal politics. That's something we would never do. We never take sides, even though people will always accuse us of doing that. But we do want to see what we can do to help the democratic process in Kenya.
There was an institution of government that happened in Kenya as a result of colonialism, which until today, many would argue that Kenya still continues to try and find its space in governance. But there's a lot of things that many could argue were imposed on Kenya's people as a result of the colonialism that happened, and are still dealing with those issues today, to try and shred off some of those things and to find its space in governance, to find its space in geopolitics, to find its own space. But I cannot do that because of these institutions that were put in place many, many years ago.
So this is something I've thought about a lot in other contexts. And I mean, to be honest, I disagree with. I think if you look at how much Kenya has changed its own institutions, so the way you started with a prime minister, for example, now you have a president and a full executive president. The way you've devolved government through the 2010 constitution to the counties shows that you started with a set of institutions, but those institutions have really changed and evolved for what Kenyans want and for the reality that you face. So I think it's sort of taking away Kenya's independence and agency to say somehow you were given these institutions and you've had no choice but to change them. I think Kenya's kept what it felt is good and works for Kenya, but where it said, no, we need something different because of our situation or because of what our people want, I think Kenya has done that. And you've had 60 years of independence now, and I think you've made a lot of those changes. Okay.
With the visit that's taking place today, rather in a few days, do you think that there's regret? Okay, you've talked about regret. Do you think then that there would be a forward-thinking kind of approach to when it came and said, look, this is where we were before, this is where Kenya is today, and, you know, can we move on? I mean, a lot of people say, well, let's move on and let's just get onto a relationship where we'll be able to speak one sovereign state to another. Do you think that relationship can really take place and flourish in that manner?
So I think we're largely there already. As I say, when I go and talk to President Ruto or talk to cabinet secretaries, we're talking about what's Kenya doing in the region, how can we help Kenya's peace-building efforts, how can we fight against Al-Shabaab together, how can we help with Kenya's amazing transition to renewable energy, and how can British firms and British expertise play a part. You talked about the Kenyan nurses who are coming to the UK, so how can those Kenyan nurses who don't have jobs in Kenya, but we have skills shortages in the UK, so how can we use those skills? So I think we're very much focused on that. But as we were talking about before, we think it's really important to talk openly about history and not to pretend that the bad things didn't happen, not to pretend that these don't still matter to people, that there aren't still issues, but to talk about them openly, but in the context of what, as you said, is a forward-looking relationship.
As equal partners?
Absolutely. We are both sovereign states. We both have one vote in the United Nations General Assembly, and we see in Kenya as a critical partner for us for the things that we'd like to do in the region. So again, you look at Somalia, where I used to be, and I used to go and visit Kenyan troops down in Kismayo who were fighting against Al-Shabaab and were playing an absolutely invaluable role. So I come to this with a deep respect for what Kenya can do on the ground.
You served in these countries, okay. You were director for Africa. So you have seen the relationship between Britain and the African countries and African governments. You served in some of these countries. You just talked about your experience in DRC during an election where everybody was looking up at you and saying you have taken sides and accusing you of taking sides. Your immediate predecessor, Jane Marriott, was accused of the same about the last election. Do you feel that these are unfair characterizations of you diplomats in the countries that you're working in?
Yes. I mean, so I know Jane well. She was a close friend, and I know absolutely she had no desire to take sides one way or the other. I've met Raila Odinga. I've talked to him about this. And I also remember that in the past, one of my other predecessors, Christian Turner, he was also accused of taking sides, but in a different direction. So this is, and he would, again, he absolutely says, no, I did not take sides. What I was trying to do was to help the election process. So I think it's something that we accept, will understand, that we accept, that people will think that we are taking sides even when we don't. So it comes back to what we're saying to CT. You have to look at your conscience and say, did I say the right thing at the right time, even if I got criticized for it?
Why do you think people make these assumptions or accusations?
So that's probably a question I should be asking you, and your advice to how that doesn't happen to me. But I think people sort of there's a suspicion, a belief that people, whatever we say, that we are somehow or other trying to interfere and that we are taking sides. That's not the case, but I understand that people are distrustful, and that's something we always have to bear in mind when we decide, do you take the Edward Clay comment or not?
Right. Do you think that Great Britain would be accepting, for example, if Kenyan leaders came in at the time of elections or came in at the time of serious decision making and made such comments in Britain or said such things, or
joint
behaved
African
in a certain
ambassador
manner,
statement.
would it be expected on the British side that, you know, this is just an observation and we want the best for Great Britain as Kenya? Would there be a quid pro quo in terms of sentiment if the same thing happened?
So I mean, if so I'm the High Commissioner in London. I know him well.
Yeah.
If he wants to talk about the election process in Britain, he absolutely can. We wouldn't want him to take sides one way or the other in the same way that we wouldn't here. But yes, it's absolutely the right of diplomats to comment and involve themselves in a helpful way, so long as they're not taking sides. It's a good question.
You know, this issue of taking sides, I am a bit confused by it.
Yeah.
Because it's like people claiming they're neutral. Is it really possible to be neutral? Is it really possible not to take sides? I mean, the moment you confer an opinion, you've taken sides.
So it's like the referee in a football match.
Yes.
Everybody thinks that they're biased, and you almost always think they're biased against your team, but every referee is absolutely convinced that they are fair.
A referee cannot be neutral. He cannot be, because if he was neutral, then he would be of no consequence. The side he takes is a side of what he must do. This is right, this is wrong. These are the rules, and you have to abide by them. Now,
that's the neutral position.
No,
So I
that's,
think
that's not neutral. This is the point.
Yeah.
See, the way I understand neutrality,
There's no position.
you're bland. You're just there.
So there's a difference between neutral and being passive. So being neutral is not taking a sides with a bias one way or the other. Passive is doing nothing, and passive, I think, is the wrong thing to do. So if we, again, I'm looking, because I haven't been through the election process in Kenya, so I'm still learning. But in DRC, if we thought that somebody was committing fraud or they were committing intimidation, then we would call that out and comment it, whoever did it.
You know, if we're to talk of our elections, fraud is always committed. People bribe in the open. This isn't something that you need to speak of in hushed terms. No. People spend tons and tons of money to get elected, contrary to what our laws even state. So we've had a parliament that has gone and restructured some of these laws so that you can spend as much as you like. Okay? So, at what point does it become something that one needs to speak against? What needs to happen? Because we have observer groups, and sometimes I wonder the purpose they serve, because they think that when you look at people voting, that is what it is, and it's peaceful. And we're saying, no, that's not it. The process of actually voting is always peaceful. It's what happens after the vote has been cast that is a problem. Now, when one wants to be neutral, if we go by my definition, it means you need to ask yourself, what is the truth of this matter? And what is it that we must look at? And if we're to speak, because with every electoral cycle that we have in this country, there's always a serious outcry, not necessarily from one person. There's usually an outcry throughout the country. And it has to do with certain activities that are considered nefarious. Yes.
So what's the question?
I wasn't asking a question. I was giving you food for thought.
No, I mean, it is, but again, it's, I thought about these things far too much.
Yes.
There is all about when is it useful for the international community to play a role? When is it more useful for us to work with other institutions? So, for example, in Kenya, the religious organizations, churches, they have played an important role in politics. They speak with authorities. So I spoke to the Anglican Archbishop about this, about the role that the church played. Are there things that we can do with Kenyan institutions? You talked about observer groups. I think they can play an important role. Human rights groups, all these other people, to try to create. He said, no country has a perfect electoral system. There's something wrong. We and others, we keep trying to change our system, but it's trying to get the elections good enough that people feel confident that the overall result reflects the will of the people, even if it's not 100% perfect. But do you need to be 99% perfect? Do you need to be 95% perfect? And I think for us, the international community, it's how can we help Kenya get to that level of where people feel, even if we lost, even if it wasn't perfect, we still feel the result was fair enough.
A former posting of yours was in Israel, obviously, and that is a site for, serious conflicts, humanitarian crisis today, war is happening. What are your thoughts about what's currently going on? What is the position of the country? I mean, what we've heard over, the past couple of weeks, but what are we looking at from your eye?
So from a personal point of view, this is a really horrendous situation. So I have friends on the Israeli side and some of the villages which were overrun. And I know people whose father's been killed, people whose daughter's been killed, who've got friends who were held hostage and so on. So it's a horrendous situation. I've also visited Gaza many times. I have colleagues working in Gaza at the moment, and they're going through an awful situation at the moment. So I think what my government is trying to do is first to bring back the hostages as quickly as possible, including a number of British hostages. Secondly, to get humanitarian aid into Gaza, and we've just announced another £20 million in British aid, and we're going to work to try to get the crossings open as quickly as possible, and to try to protect the civilians who are in Gaza, but also to stop the conflict spreading any further. And we've seen already on the Israel-Lebanon border, tensions go up there, the risk that Hezbollah and other groups get dragged into the conflict, which would be disastrous for everybody. So we want to try to find ways whereby we can stop the conflict spreading and help the civilians on both sides as much as possible. But we're very clear that this conflict was started by Hamas committing awful atrocities against Israeli civilians.
What is the British government's position on this particular matter? We've seen other governments that have come out and said they unconditionally stand with Israel.
So we stand with Israel. We completely support Israel's right to self-defense against terrorist attacks in the way that we supported Kenya when it suffered terrorist attacks in the past. But we expect all of our partners, all of our allies, to respect international humanitarian law in the way that they undertake military operations. And we are deeply concerned for the civilian population of Gaza and how they can be. And Hamas is using them as human shields. It's hiding in the middle of population areas. And I've been to Gaza. I know it's an extremely difficult area for military campaigns. So we hope that Israel will do everything that it can to minimize civilian suffering.
But don't you think that's a big concern to all commentators, really, when those that are supporting Israel express concern and hope that the civilian population in Gaza will not be affected directly by the ongoing war. But then there is not much pressure being applied on Israel to make sure that they observe international law.
So, I mean, so to say, we know that the civilian population in Gaza is suffering. That is absolutely clear. And I know this having from my old job, we have very clear conversations with the government of Israel about making sure that it does do what it can to protect civilian populations. As I said, that's extremely difficult to do in Gaza. And we've seen a lot of misinformation going on about what's going on, including the appalling disaster at the hospital in Gaza. So it's really important that people don't leap to judgment about what's happening.
But every passing day, those innocent people who are in Gaza, who cannot leave, either because they're being forced to stay by Hamas or because they are prevented from leaving by Israel, are continuing to suffer.
Absolutely.
Is the international community doing enough for the individual innocent people who are residents of Gaza?
I mean, in a way, we're never doing enough because the civilians still are suffering. But one of the fundamental problems is that Hamas continues to hold over 200 hostages, including a number of British nationals. And it's essential that those hostages are given back and are treated fairly.
Not 200. Just from your own words, Ambassador, it sounds like they're holding millions hostage. So because they're preventing civilians from living.
So what Hamas has done has absolutely made life for the civilians in Gaza much worse. And that's why we view Hamas as a terrorist organization.
I know that there is the immediacy of action for people to be released. But also, if we look at the origins of this conflict, of this war, they did not start in 2023. These are deep-seated. This is a historic conflict. And those who've come round to either say it is on this side that they are, or this is where the support is being lent, is there. I mean, I know that there have been several occasions where world leaders, different countries have come together to have a conversation and to look for a way out of what has been happening in this region for years. But is it not time that those things started to happen again, whereby we're looking for a solution to the historic issue, as opposed to having this kind of, I'm giving my support here, I'm giving my support here, without looking at where, again, the history lies?
So I agree very strongly with all of that. And I served in Israel before in 2002 to 2006, where there was a conflict going on, but also there were live efforts to reach a peace process. And we and others really hoped that we could get to that stage. If I'm honest, the peace process hasn't gone anywhere for a number of years now. I think the leadership on neither side has been able to make the concessions that would lead to a meaningful peace process. You hope that a crisis like this would increase the momentum towards that, and that's what we will certainly try to support, those long-term efforts, so we don't go through this cycle of conflict again. It's really too soon to know whether that can happen this time, particularly when the conflict is as intense as it is.
From what you're saying, it sounds like there are hardliners on both sides. There are hardliners on the Palestinian side, Hamas being one of those that completely clear hardline. There must be hardliners on the Israeli side.
So, I mean, certainly Hamas are committed to the complete destruction of the state of Israel. So there is really while they maintain that position, it's very hard to see how there will be anything other than a spoiler and a negative action. We've absolutely seen that now. Within Israel, there is a majority that is committed to the two-state solution, but as in any country, there are some who are opposed to the two-state solution and don't think it's the right thing to do. I mean, you talked and do about this being a very long conflict. It is an incredibly difficult conflict with a lot of history and a lot of feelings on both sides, and very real worries. Israelis have very real worries for how can they come up with a Palestinian state which will protect Israeli security. Palestinians have their right to live in sovereignty and with just and equal rights. And trying to balance all these things is very difficult. The conflict has gone on for so long because it's such a difficult and intractable conflict. And that's why I'd love to say I can see something positive coming out of this, but I know from experience how hard it is to achieve that.
You know, the conflicts such as the one that we see in Israel cannot exist and cannot last for as long as it has without external support for both parties, whether it is Hamas or whether it is Israel. Now, the problem with what we now have is that the very peace that you're hoping would come about, in my mind, is actually becomes even remoter, because those who seek to benefit from such conflict will have their positions entrenched even further, and whatever narrative they have been pursuing will be strengthened even further.
So we absolutely see people who have funded Hamas and other terrorist organizations and driven some of the instability that we see and seek to profit from instability and to exploit that. And certainly when it comes to counter-terrorism, that's always a problem where you have external groups funding a terrorist group. That makes it far harder to deal with, and that's a truth that we've experienced everywhere. When it comes to responsibility, though, it really is the Palestinians and the Israelis. They need to make peace between themselves, and it's really the international community can play a supportive role, but fundamentally it's the responsibility of those two leaderships to reach an agreement, and we and others can only support that.
As you come to the conclusion, let's come back to the visit by their Majesties next week. Is there going to be a public rally anywhere where people can see King Charles III?
So I know that the King and Queen both really like meeting people, and one of the things we really want to do on the visit is to give them opportunities to meet normal Kenyans. So we're trying to do that as much as we can. Of course, because of security, that's a little bit difficult, but we will try to do that as much as possible so they get a sense of some of the variety and some of the energy that I've seen in Kenya and that I've enjoyed so much.
Okay.
You could ask them to come to the show.
This is a place that they can meet ordinary people.
Like us.
Yeah, are you ordinary people, really?
Ambassador, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you all very much.
Your first interview on Kenyan radio, how did it go?
So far, so good.
Good.
But I'll listen to see what the listeners say, and they can tell me.
Very good. Come for the second. And
I look forward to it.
Neil Wigan is the British High Commissioner to Kenya. He's been our guest this morning. We're talking about the planned visit by the Majesties King Charles III and Queen Camilla to Kenya next week, starting 31st of October and up to 3rd of November. Keep it here for more conversations coming up in the next hour. Good morning, 9 a.m.
This is the Situation Room, the only way to start your day.